So the optimist in me, who admittedly is just like a little tiny sliver of myself these days.
Cold dark.
But yeah, it's still in there. And like I see this as a net good, especially for the time. I see a lot of people reading this and feeling like, oh, generosity, like, you know, you're helping out people, but it also helps you feel better, helps you, and brings you joy. And I think that's totally true. The cynical side of me looks at this and wonders, is it enough? Does it change the dynamic significantly between the classes? Does it change that Scrooge has all this wealth? Yes, he's giving some of it away, but how much? Welcome, friends, to episode 330 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Charles Dickens' 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol. This is one that I feel like we probably should have covered by now. It's, you know, one of the most famous Christmas stories of all time. It's got 1 million adaptations. And as I was jumping into this, I was also realizing we've never done a Charles Dickens adaptation before. This is our first time discussing this author entirely, so pretty excited for this week.
Yeah, I mean, massive literary figure. It's interesting to read him because I feel like I knew I've never read this work before,
right,
but I knew the story so intimately through, you know, cultural osmosis as well as like a bunch of different adaptations of it. And man, it's just this, like, reading it and thinking about the time period that he was writing it in, how much of this is just like a class hero story kind of, or at least like having you stop and think, slow down a little bit for our busy everyday lives and try to think about others. And then it always leaves me with such an uplifting sort of feeling at the end when you're kind of left to think about your own mortality and then like how you treat people and how joyous life can be if you choose to make it that way. Yeah,
and would you say that it's kind of the Christmas spirit, right? Like it kind of captures, there's a generosity of spirit and a warmth that he put into the story, and like he's kind of responsible, not fully, but like he is partially responsible for that being the modern conception of Christmas. And this story is a big reason why. There was a time where Christmas was falling out of favor, and celebrating, especially in the cities, was starting to become less frequent, and people weren't into the caroling and all this stuff. And he wrote this as like an attempt to bring it back and sort of put focus on family, put focus on generosity of spirit and things like that. We'll get into all of that soon. But I just want to say before we get much further, I was just at Dragonsteel Nexus in Salt Lake City, and it was a whirlwind, really, really fun experience. And I'm going to talk more about it at the end of the episode, but just briefly up front, I just want to thank everybody who came out to the panels I was on. I was lucky enough to be on 3 different panels, and they were all like super well attended. One of them had over 1,000 people in the crowd, I read somewhere. It was the one on adaptations. So I got to talk about adaptations, and that was super fun. And then I was at Fonda Lee's booth basically the rest of the time, and I was helping her out, helping sell books, which I had never done before. Was a very cool experience, and I got to meet a bunch of people there too. So it was great. And you know, if you're listening after hearing me talk at Dragonsteel Nexus, you know, welcome. Hopefully you enjoy this and stick around.
I was so excited for you to go to this convention, and I'm so tapped into the Brandon Sanderson Cosmere sort of stuff, and I've gone to conventions where he was at before and seen the fervor of which his fans,
it was on full display at this
and I had like an inkling of what you were in for, and I kept being really excited for you, and then just seeing how your reaction to it so far, I've been like, I can tell it lived up to that and more. I'm sure it was incredible and this like crazy experience.
I fully expected it, but it even exceeded that, and we'll get into reasons why. But then the other thing I want to say briefly is like I was so excited for the amount of Greenbone fans that were there. Yeah. There were so many people who were so excited to talk to Fonda. And just as someone who's been friends with her for a while now, it was just really cool to see. She had a great time. So yeah, we'll talk more about that at the end. For now, let's shift our focus back to Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. You touched on it a little bit earlier. You said you hadn't read this before, but you think you know, cultural osmosis, seen some adaptations. Do you have any recollection of what you think your first exposure to this story would have been?
Yeah, honestly, I was thinking about this when reading the story, and I don't know that I can pinpoint where exactly my first experience was with this. It just feels like I was born and it was there and it was already in my mind. I genuinely like feel like maybe I saw like a Muppets adaptation, but it didn't make like an impact on me to where I like that's my version or anything like that. But it's just like I know the story inside and out, and maybe it's just from people retelling around the holidays or something. Maybe it is kind of word of mouth thing. I couldn't pinpoint.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm the same. Like, I was trying to think about it, and like, I know I saw the film that we're going to cover, Scrooged, at some point, but when I saw that, I'm pretty sure I was already exposed to the story of Christmas Carol. And I knew that this was like a retelling. So like, I think I'd seen it in cartoon form at some point, or maybe Muppet form, like you said. I'm not really sure. Or, maybe there was a version of it that was like read to me as a child, although I definitely don't remember my mom reading like this entire novella. That would have been way too much. So yeah, I don't know either. It's one of those stories that's just always been around and I've always heard about. But yeah, we're going to cover Scrooged, as I alluded to there. It is kind of a fun 80s retelling. And that's something that I was reading happens a lot with these adaptations, is they kind of, adapt a little bit to the time period that they come out in. But often, certain themes resurface and certain things are sort of always present. So it'll be interesting to talk about that with that movie and see like what people were worried about in the 80s and compared to when this originally came out in the 1800s. And then compared to today, because it also occurred to me that we are in a time, and that weird serendipitous thing that happens with this podcast a lot, where there is a death of a CEO in the news. Yeah. And a lot of people are talking about rich people taking advantage of poor people in this country. And there's a lot of like class consciousness right now, I feel like, on social media. A lot of people like recognizing differences in class and like recognizing, like the different treatment that
inequality.
Like, yeah. Well, yeah. But then also like the way that murder was treated compared to hundreds of other murders that happen in New York City and don't, have huge national manhunts. It's like, why is this one getting so much attention? Oh, because the person who died was rich. So it just really shows like status and just the reality of that in our country. And it's really interesting that is like top of mind right now in the zeitgeist. And then we read this and it's like, oh, this has been a problem for a long time. Definitely going back to the Industrial Revolution, because this is one of the main things that Charles Dickens was talking about and was interested in talking about. And we'll get into his life story as to why he was interested in it. But he wanted to have people pay attention to the working class and the poor and what was going on with them, and have people in upper class and middle class like actually care. Because unlike nowadays, where there's the internet and there's like all this communication, if you were sequestered in the upper class, you often were not aware of what was going on with the poor, and you were told that like a lot of people who were poor deserved it, and so there was a lot of, and that still goes on today, but it was like easier to internalize that, and so like he wanted his fiction to sort of be a bridge between the classes and show like you can have empathy for the poor, and in some ways I was reading that Dickens is credited as being behind like one of the biggest social movements or affecting the biggest amount of social change in the UK, which of course spills over to everywhere else in the world, of all time. Like he's really a huge figure in that regard, especially when we're talking about people being aware of the working class and the poor and what the conditions are like for them.
Between this and the other, I know we're going to get to this, but we're going to talk about other works we may have read by him. And I read Oliver Twist growing up, and I know that's Charles Dickens. And like between this and that, it's very clear that he's trying to, like you said, create, because I assume he was probably a part of maybe the more upper class in society. And but I don't know his history.
I'll share it with you soon.
Yeah. So, but his idea of like creating these stories, creating empathy for the less fortunate, it's not. I don't think that it was a popular thing to do of the time, but it is like something that even today, it makes you stop and think, and it makes you slow down, and like especially around the holidays and stuff like that. I think that people like to get into the spirit of giving and going to soup kitchens and things like that and helping out. And I have like,
that spirit of giving, man. A lot of that
to this story
is from Dickens. Like he wanted that to be something that we celebrated. Now that a lot of that is tied to Christianity in general, but there's a lot of debate among scholars about how secular versus religious this story is. And some view it as being very religious, but others don't.
So for me, I didn't see it as being very religious, obviously given my background, but I'm thinking about it and I'm like, these ghosts and the way that they're operating in the system, it just doesn't feel very like Jesus or God, which I kind of like too, because we're getting like a Christmas story that's also got like a good class message.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, there's like supernatural elements that I like could always go in for growing up and still do. Like I love that kind of genre stuff. And I'm like, it's literally a Christmas ghost story.
Well, and people would, if you were on the religious side, which I'm not, you would probably argue that a lot of these morals come from the Bible, come from like Christian teachings, and it's sort of infused into the story. But I totally see what you're saying. And there's the class elements, but then there's a lot that is sort of separate from that and is almost humanist in a way that I appreciate. It's almost about just celebrating your fellow man and like the spirit of generosity and giving back and recognizing, your own privilege and like being generous with that for people who don't, who aren't afforded the same luxuries. That is all to me divorced from religion. So I like to view this as a secular way, but that's because I'm a secular person. So I feel like it's open to that, multiple interpretations, which a lot of great works of literature are. What did you think about reading this today? Obviously this was written in the 1840s. Style's very different. But this is an author that people continue to read today. And continue to appreciate his work. Although there's some criticisms you will see out there that I don't want to like seed into this conversation just yet. But like, how did you feel about reading it? Did you have any criticisms that were coming up throughout? Like, what would keep you from wanting to go back to Dickens? I guess just as even casually.
I honestly didn't feel like I ran into much. I thought I actually expected it to be harder to read. I expected it to be like less. It felt very modern in a sense. I think the way that he goes about. I think he takes a long time to get to his point. Sometimes he kind of like spirals before he like eventually like lands at the point.
A little wordy, a little long-winded, overly descriptive, perhaps.
Maybe, but I thought for me, especially with it being such a short novella, like I was along for the ride, and it wasn't something that really like was an obstacle for me.
Yeah, this is a short project, so that is going to probably not be as much of a problem for us. When he has longer novels, where maybe we would encounter that more. But yeah, I mean that's touching on a little bit of it. Like defenders would say that like he has absolutely gorgeous prose, and I think he does. His descriptions are often stunning, incredibly evocative. This is a time that predates television by a large margin, right? This was really the dawn of like widely available press, and the printing press was I don't know my exact dates, but like we had newspapers were becoming a bigger thing, periodicals, magazines, and he would go on to write and release his stuff in serialized format. So it would be coming out chapter by chapter, and people would be following along. And one of the things that he was credited as doing is like I said before, he's trying to demonstrate the life and conditions of the working class. But beyond that, just like he ended up having worldwide readership. So I think he also wanted to tell people what it was like in London, because if you don't live in London, all you know is what you hear or read. And so he was committed to, I think, trying to evoke life in the city. And he both like loved the city, but also had a lot of social commentary on the conditions there. So I think that dichotomy is really interesting when you read his descriptions are both like loving and sort of celebratory in as they're evoking, like the life of on the street. At the same time, like what is being described can often be sort of grimy and uncomfortable and clearly difficult to live in. So I think that was all intentional, and that leads to a style that many consider quite flowery. I even see this phrase brought up a lot where it's like, oh, he was paid by the word, and so he wanted to write things in as long a possible way as possible. And it kind of makes me laugh because like writers are often paid by the word. That's not really that unusual. It's like, oh, Charles Dickens, the writer who was paid by the word. Like, so are like many, if not all, other writers. So yeah, I mean, I don't really buy that. I think it's more just that was his style. He wanted to evoke because this was for people who hadn't seen it. And he wanted to make you feel like you were there. And I think he really does that. And there's a certain appreciation I can have for that while still recognizing that at times maybe it goes on a little long. So that's just going to be subjective. Yeah, I don't know. I enjoyed reading this. Definitely, I always appreciate, the turns of phrase, and like there's a style of speaking, 1800s English people, especially in the Dickensian way, that it has a certain feel to it, and it's classic. It kind of washes over you in a way, and I'll go ahead and say I experienced this story as an audiobook on Audible because it's free. Nice. You can, if you have a subscription, I guess, to audio or to Audible, you get it for free, and it's Hugh Grant reading it. And he's great. He does an awesome performance, does all these voices and everything. And like, he has the perfect voice for this story. So, I really liked that. And so if anybody wants to hear Hugh Grant read it, I think you can get it on Audible for free.
You were talking about how Dickens, like his voice is so specific and like, I wanted to note too, like it's quite funny and clever. I love like how clever it can be at times, the story, the way that he like goes about, like you said, some of his metaphors or the ways that
he is quite funny. Like, he learned early on that humor sells. Like, humor is interesting to read. It lowers people's defenses. It brings them in. So he often found ways to infuse a lot of his descriptions with humor. Totally agree.
Yeah. And that specific voice too, like it feels, while it does feel like Victorian era England, it also to me feels pretty modern, and it feels like it doesn't feel like it has that barrier that like old English has.
Yeah, well, he wanted his stuff to be highly accessible. That was by design. We might view it as a bit flowery now, but like this was considered highly readable for the time, right? This was considered, I don't know, maybe lowbrow, but not really, but like at least middle brow, right? Like, it wasn't like something only for the upper class. It was for everybody.
Definitely very everyman, and that fits the story, right? That fits the context and the content of what he's trying to tell. But yeah, overall, I just like being the kind of person I am. I appreciated the story. Looking back, something from the 1800s doesn't always hold up very well, but like looking at it from the class systems and everything, I was like, this story just still does have a really strong message that carries through, and just like towards the morality of humans and caring about your fellow man, and like and then again in a selfish way also like how helping others can make you feel better about yourself, and that's something that like
altruism.
to like key in on that. That's something that like there may have been people in the upper class that thought, oh, will it make me feel better about myself for doing something? So there's like a dual sort of purpose in some capacity.
That sometimes becomes the question about altruism, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, it's like a good thing is, I guess, is a net positive, and like, but
I think so.
The fact that he knew to kind of like prey on that for the upper class possibly, and then also just to bring that attention to less fortunate people.
Well, you're touching on something that I read, is that he knew how to talk to the upper class. And he knew to include characters from the upper and middle classes and make them not necessarily villains, right? Like to have people that you could identify with if you were in those social circles. And he knew that would be a way to bridge that gap. He did a lot of that on purpose. So let's talk about him as a person. And I can reveal some of these questions we've been asking here. So Charles John Huffman Dickens was born in 1812. And he would die in 1870 at the age of 58. He was an English novelist, journalist, short story writer, and social critic who created some of literature's best-known fictional characters and is regarded by many as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. Now, you could probably argue that with Jane Austen and some other big names we've talked about, but a lot of people put it at Dickens.
Dickens is that name I feel like that's brought up often as like the author, like that was one of the most successful ever, or just in general like what he means to. He's like, I feel like people tend to put him like a rung below like a Shakespeare or something like that, like
certainly
in
terms of, like,
a
huge name, right?
Edgar Allan Poe, and they say they speak about Dickens in the same breath, but also Jane Austen and many of the other people you just said.
Yeah, Mary Shelley.
Mary Shelley.
There's a lot. I mean, but it's hard to argue Dickens, right? Argue against him, right? Like he's certainly got the pedigree, certainly got the work that has stood the test of time.
You mentioned some of the most iconic characters too, and just I was thinking about how like Ebenezer Scrooge is like the most like iconic name I've ever heard for a character.
So those character names are one of the things he's known for. He always came up with these like fantastic character names that like evoke something about the character. His characters were often very over the top and almost like caricatures. And this is something that people both praise and criticize about his work, right? And it was done often to be humorous. But you're often like making fun of people for physical characteristics and things like that. So there's sort of a double-edged thing going on there, but that's definitely something he's known for. The word Dickensian really is just meaning like Dickens, right? Like something is like Dickens, but you can be used in many different ways. It can be used as a way to like talk about squalor, to talk about like, shining a light on working conditions. It could be used in a way to talk about the way someone makes characters. It could be in a Dickensian way, meaning they're very over the top, very sort of archetypal or exaggerated. Or it could be, used in any number of ways, like maybe you're too wordy, so someone might call it Dickensian. So it's an interesting adjective because it really just references his work, but people use it in different ways in, literary criticism. Okay, so let's talk about more of his life here. So as a young kid, he was born in Portsmouth, and he would go on these walks with his dad. They were pretty poor. Like his dad worked for the Navy, and had like a small amount of money he was bringing into a large family. He had a family of 8, but 2 of his siblings would die young. But one of the moments in his life that he would go on to remember is as a kid, they were walking down the street and they pointed at this mansion that his father said, if you work really hard one day, you're going to be able to afford that mansion, even though they were poor. And he always kind of like fixed on this mansion. It was like, oh, that would be the dream, right? At age 12, his family was in dire straits financially, and it's unclear about which one happened first, whether he started working first or his father got put. So his father and his family got put into debtor's prison. They had to literally they had owed too much money, so they had to go live in this area called debtor's prison. And Charles Dickens got a job at age 12 in a shoe polish factory. That the working conditions were squalid. There was rats. He got paid 6 pence a week for his work, and he was one of the only people bringing in money at the time for his family. So he would give some of it as he could to his family. Ended up being able to like rent his own place. I was reading too. So fully like kind of supporting his huge family, but also renting his own place. 12 years old, working this these crazy conditions. This would go on for like a year. And became obviously very influential onto his work going forward. This is something he would never forget. Eventually, his father inherited money from his father's mother, so his grandmother, Charles Dickens' grandmother, passed away, left him some inheritance, and they were able to get the family out of debtor's prison. But that was a period that was very difficult for young Charles Dickens. So at 15, he would become a junior law clerk for an attorney, where he would learn to write and started developing his skills as a storyteller. He had always wanted to be an actor. That was like his main dream in life, was he wanted to be an actor. But he, during this period, learned to write stories about people, and he learned to write them in a way that was entertaining. And he learned that humor was a thing that people found entertaining. So that was something that he started from a pretty young age. Eventually, he would go on to become a journalist and a reporter a few years later, and he started working and reporting on the government. So he started understanding like how government works and how difficult it was to pass laws to change things that would affect the lives of people. Like he sort of saw all that from the inside, saw corruption, saw stagnation, things like that. Around this time, he met the daughter of his editor, Catherine Hogarth was her name, and after only 3 months of dating, he proposed to her. They would go on to get married and eventually have 10 children together. During this time, he began writing fiction. He was able to start writing his work in a serialized form through something called the Pickwick Papers. Really began at about age 24. Starts publishing his work in serialized form. At first, it was kind of slow to catch on, but eventually started building. He started building a fandom. He started becoming kind of a local celebrity. As people started following these works chapter by chapter, they'd start talking about it, much like we have today with television, right? And this was kind of a new thing. People were talking about like what's going to happen next, and they would theorize about what's going to happen next. And this built like a word of mouth fandom for him. And his writing started taking off. Around this time, he would start to like inform his writing. He would start going on trips around in London to visit different areas. So he would go to orphanages. If there were like reports of orphanages being particularly, having particularly bad conditions, he would go to them and observe them. And he would also go to asylums and he observed the conditions there in different areas like that, because he wanted to know about the conditions for like the worst and the poorest places in London, so he could accurately write about them. And he put a lot of that into his fiction. That's where you get Oliver Twist, I think, was around this time, and a lot of these kind of iconic works started to take form. Throughout this, he starts becoming even more of a celebrity, right? Becomes, known throughout the country, and then his work starts spreading and starts to become known throughout the Western world. He's becoming more and more famous, starting to bring in more and more money. And around 1842, he and his wife would travel to the U.S. And they would begin a tour, like a reading tour, where he would go, and he had a policy that if you were in the working class, if you wanted to come listen to him, like tickets were like way cheaper. So he like priced his tickets really cheap for the working class, in particular. So he always kind of had this like social, mind that he wanted to try and be fair with that. So pretty cool. He did that for a few years. I think I saw that he went to Switzerland and a few other countries on these reading tours. And he ended up bringing in a lot of money doing this. And really was starting to build a bit of a fortune through his writing. Around this time, he would form something called the Home for Homeless Women, which in particular would teach skills for a lot of homeless women who would often be forced into sex work or to go to these workhouses, which is a thing that he exposed in a lot of his writing. There was this practice in England of these workhouses where if you were found, there was like a law that was passed. If you were found living on the street, you would be taken to a workhouse, and it was basically a prison that forced you to work. So it was essentially illegal to be homeless. They would throw you in prison where you had to work, and the conditions in those places were terrible, as you can imagine. And he knew that a lot of women were either forced into sex work or being forced to live in these places. So he wanted to help them out, created this Home for Homeless Women, which would teach skills that you could then transition into the workforce outside of these areas and maintain a sense of freedom. So that was like one of his big charitable acts that he sort of did once he started building this fortune. I'm
really glad to hear that he's the type of person that not only wrote about this kind of stuff but lived it and wanted to kind of go out of his way to because it clearly was important to him. But some of the time it's almost like exploitative. It could be, he's going to view these places and he's writing about them and then not really like backing it up.
Right.
But it's cool to hear that as far as you've seen that he was backing it up.
Yeah, I mean, and you could always argue like, could he have done things differently? But when he was observing these places, he would then go on to write about them, and he would bring attention to them, which again, you could say that these days, and it means something completely different. Back then, it was like people just didn't know, and in fact, there's like people in aristocracy were quoted like reading his stuff and saying like, "Is this what it's really like? I didn't know." And like deciding to try and help out some of these conditions because like a lot of people in the upper class just didn't know what was going on. It was kind of kept from them, right? So he did a lot of work in that way that I think is for a social good through his writing. So at age 44, he would go and buy the house that his dad pointed at, the mansion.
Wow.
So at age 44, he bought this house, and it would become his like summer home outside of the city because it's like in the countryside, like outside of London. And it would be like his favorite place to go. Unfortunately, around this time, he also started having difficulties with his wife. Their marriage was sort of on the outs, and it's unclear why exactly. There's some debate about this, which I'll get into, but he would spend a lot of time at this house that he bought, throwing parties, like having big social events. And I guess she would spend a lot of time in the city. They spent a lot of time apart. At this time, it wasn't really like you could get a divorce, but especially as a public figure like him, it was considered like a big scandal, and it wasn't something that people really did. But it seemed like, modern day, they probably would have gotten a divorce. So as recently as 2014, these letters were uncovered that showed that he started trying to get his marriage dissolved and have his wife committed because she was having mental problems. And there's a lot of descriptions about her. And people, of course, questioned the veracity of this. Was she actually having these problems? Or was this him trying to get out of this relationship and sort of formulating them? Unclear. Obviously, this happened a long time ago, so it's not really known from what I was seeing. Again, this is stuff that I was just reading about recently, so I don't know all the details. But also around this time, he began having an affair with an 18-year-old actress who would come out to the parties that he was throwing. Her name was Ellen, and he would go on to have an affair with her for about 13 years. That became like his new partner as he became more and more separated from his wife.
As tends to happen with these things, these people get put on pedestals, and we hear all this good that they do and all of that, and then often there are also skeletons in the closet, and it sounds like he's not a saint. So
right, he's a person, right?
Like, good to note that there's two sides to the coin.
Yeah, and 18, he was like in his 40s, like early 40s, probably around the time they started this affair. Definitely looks really terrible today. You would also note this is a time period where people were working at age 12, so 18 was maybe a little older than it is today, but not really to write it off. It's still, it is what it is.
Yeah, bit young, but also it's the possibly committing your wife thing too. Is like that seems like it could be. I mean,
and it's unclear. Like maybe she was having some severe mental problems. Some people argued that she was, and that was why.
Gotcha.
I don't know. Again, I am only just starting to research this, so forgive me if I've missed some big thing. But this is from.
I'm just a skeptic, all right? I'm just being skeptical.
Fair. No, and it's totally fair to think that this might be, the usual shitty dude behavior. I think his defenders would say, but look at the rest of his life and, look at how he had conducted himself. And a lot of that seems to point to a guy who was pretty good, it seems like, overall. So further evidence of this, I think. Or at least, and also just an interesting note of the thing that happened. He's continuing to go on and have success, growing quite wealthy with his writing. In 1865, he and his mistress, Ellen, were on a train that derailed while at a river crossing. There was repairs being done on the track, and the conductor didn't know about it. And when it derailed, the entire first class, all of the first class cars went over the side into the river, except for one, which was left dangling, held up by just the weight of the rest of the train. This was the car that he was in. So he's in there dangling.
Yeah. This is definitely a scene from a movie, by the way.
Yeah, right? So, unclear. I wasn't clear what happened with Ellen. She seems to have been okay, so maybe she was able to climb out. I didn't read that. And then I was also unclear how he got out, but he was able to get out. But then he went down into the water. Maybe he jumped down directly into the water from the dangling. I'm not sure. He went down into the water and drug a bunch of people to the shore who were struggling in the water. Apparently pulled a bunch of different people out, and several of them died in his arms, it was said. Several people died. Wow. And then after he did all of that and was trying to help out with that, he realized that his manuscript that he was working on, the only existing copy of it, was still in the dangling train car. And he went back into it to retrieve it, climbed down into it, and was able to retrieve the manuscript and climb back out. So risked his life to retrieve it. And this was for a book, I think it was called A Mutual Friend, I believe, was the manuscript. So not one of his most famous works, but still, he went back to rescue it, couldn't let it go. But after the effects of this, he would go on to have PTSD about this event for the rest of his life, and he would become afraid of travel. He didn't like travel anymore, and he especially didn't like to be on trains anymore. Had a lot of PTSD about this, kind of understandably. Yeah. And at some point, a few years later, he got offered to come to America. They requested him. They wanted to pay him to come to America to do another tour. And they offered him £20,000, which I was reading that in today's money is roughly $1 million. To come on this tour, and it was so much money that he accepted. He was like, I can't say no to that, so I'm gonna go do it. But apparently, his health never recovered from this trip. When he got back, he was just in poor health, and he never really recovered. I didn't see why and how this was all linked, but at age 58, he would have a stroke that would end up killing him. But apparently, he worked up until the day he died. And it was sudden. It wasn't something that was expected at all. He thought he was going to live much longer. So when he died, he was in the middle of writing this murder mystery novel. And again, in his way of doing it, it was being published week to week, right? The novel was called Edwin Drood, and he died before revealing who the murderer was. So this has become a long, bit of theorization, his diehard fans talking about who was the killer, what was intended, and all this stuff, because it was never finished.
Wow.
So it's this kind of dangling thread that to this day people talk about. He would be buried in Westminster Abbey. He was a hugely popular figure and beloved. A lot of people, would come and like leave flowers at his gravesite, and to this day it continues to be highly visited. So that was Charles Dickens. Really interesting figure. Like I said, like a big force for social change and shining a light on the poor. Worked himself, as a child in a factory, and continued to be sort of a champion for the working class and poor throughout his life.
And that comes off in this work here, A Christmas Carol. I was like picking up on that so much, and it's cool to hear, for the most part, that he lived that life. And I guess in a sense, I was wrong because he didn't like come up in money, but he eventually was rich and was able to
certainly
like, maybe
became
that's
rich through his writing.
And maybe that's how he was able to bridge the sort of social hierarchy that we're talking about here, of like speaking to the upper class, but also like in service of the less fortunate, possibly.
Yeah. So we've talked about some of his most famous works. I mean, there's also A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. I feel like I've read either some or part of a lot of these in school, but it's been so long that I don't really remember.
Well, the funny thing about A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations is that I know the story. Again, cultural osmosis, or if I'm not sure if like people reference the material often, obviously. So
he's also well known for his book David Copperfield, and then also Bleak House, which is another one I feel like I've heard about a lot. I don't necessarily know. I don't think I know what a lot of those stories are. And I know a lot of these, if not all of them, have adaptations. So these are all things we could do in the future. So if anybody has any favorite Dickens adaptations, definitely let us know in the comments, and then we'll keep an eye on them and think about returning to him. Because after reading this, I'm like, it's a cool Christmas project, and it's a very Christmas focused thing. But I would like to read like one of his really famous works of literature that is maybe like not as tied to a holiday. But this is really fun, and also this might be his most well known work of all of these.
Yeah,
I was reading.
So where does this come in his career? Do you know if this is earlier
so
or later?
He wrote this in 1843. So I believe this is like he was already having some success. This is around the time when he was doing these trips to the U.S. for the first time. Around that period, his relationship was starting to go onto the rocks with his original wife. So around that spot, was already having some success, but wanted to shine a light on. He was really influenced by Washington Irving, which I thought was fun, who we covered for The Headless Horseman.
Yeah.
Right. So apparently Washington Irving had like written a bunch of essays about Christmas, and Dickens loved them.
Which is Sleepy Hollow, right?
Yeah, Sleepy Hollow. Yes. And Dickens loved them, and he wanted to do his own. So he wrote several stories, including this one, that were all Christmas related, as he was sort of influenced by that. So I just thought that was a cool connection I saw.
That is cool.
All right, so the book is divided into 5 staves. We're going to start off with stave 1 and 2. So A Christmas Carol opens on a bleak, cold Christmas Eve in London, 7 years after the death of Ebenezer Scrooge's business partner, Jacob Marley. Scrooge is an aging miser who dislikes Christmas and refuses a dinner invitation from his nephew, Fred. He turns away 2 men seeking a donation to provide food and heating for the poor, and only grudgingly allows his overworked, underpaid clerk, Bob Cratchit, Christmas Day off with pay to conform to the social custom. That night, Scrooge is visited at his home by Marley's ghost, who wanders the earth entwined by heavy chains and money boxes forged during a lifetime of greed and selfishness. Marley tells Scrooge that he has a single chance to avoid the same fate. He will be visited by 3 spirits and must listen or be cursed to carry much heavier chains of his own. So let's stop there. This is the setup for the novel. We get Scrooge, who is like over-the-top caricature, as I said, of this miserly rich dude. I read somewhere, too, that not only was this something that Dickens had seen, obviously, with these like captains of industry, but it was something he was worried about becoming himself. There's a little bit of like a fear, like he did not want to become Scrooge. And so there's a little bit of himself, and that's what you see like some of the whole beginnings start to come out as we see later on. But yeah, what did you think of Scrooge and the setup for this thing?
You talked about the cultural significance of what's going on currently, and the idea of like capitalism and rampant capitalism, and you see people who are greedy for the sake of being greedy, and it just brings to like, I think it's interesting that Dickens is wanting to be careful, because I think all of us can get caught up in this system that we're a part of here, and being like, I got to make money, I got to do this, I got to be ruthless. And like, I like that
Yeah.
that right away he's this over the top character. Like he's taking it to an extreme, but I think it's still effective in like getting everybody's attention and being like, this guy fucking sucks. And yeah, nobody wants to be like that.
He's been twisted, and like his grip is like, you know, a vice, and he's like so cold now, and he's clearly been corrupted by the influence of money, right?
And I love the way that Dickens is like talking about, he's like walking down the street and no one would ever say hi to him. Just like his energy that he's giving off, you just know right away that person is just sour and doesn't want to be a part of anything.
All his employees hate him.
Yep.
Like everybody dislikes this man. He dislikes everybody. He's just miserable. Like he's got all this wealth, but he's miserable. But also there's like a humor here too, though, especially as he starts encountering this ghost. I thought was quite funny, because he like doesn't believe it. Like even as it shows up and he's like talking to him, he's like, "You don't believe in me, do you?" And he's like, "No, you could just be like a bit of undigested mustard or something." Like he starts saying like things like that. He's like, "I can't believe you."
Yeah. This is where I'm also like, this is not very biblical to me. Like this like ghost covered in chains coming back. It's very like horror-ish,
but also very thematic, right? Like it's yes. chains that he forged himself, and they're like tied to money boxes and like.
Yeah, I was gonna say like it's all the like greed that he's like kept with him still, and it's like chained him to this world almost. Like he can't go have whatever they want. And this story would have you believe heaven, but he can't go on to anything beyond this life because he was so tied to it.
Yeah, he's like cursed or doomed or something. It seems like
And I like that he's like telling Scrooge, he's like, "You're in for worse than me, buddy."
Yeah. He's
like, "This is bad, right? But you're gonna get fucking even worse."
And then there was like the end of this scene where Scrooge goes and like looks out the window, and he sees all these other ghosts are like walking the streets, and they're all got chains, and they're like dragging, like one's dragging a safe and stuff. So it like even drives that message even like home even more. All these people just like chained to money and greed. So also kind of broadening it out to be like, this is a problem in London, perhaps, right? Okay, so stave 2, let's move on. The first spirit, the ghost of Christmas past, takes Scrooge to Christmas scenes of Scrooge's boyhood, reminding him of a time when he was more innocent. The scenes reveal Scrooge's lonely childhood at a boarding school, his relationship to his beloved sister Fan, the long-dead mother of Fred, and a Christmas party hosted by his first employer, Mr. Fezziwig, who treated him like a son. Scrooge's neglected fiancée Belle is shown ending their relationship as she realizes that he will never love her as much as he loves money. Finally, they visit a now-married Belle with her large, happy family on the Christmas Eve that Marley died. Scrooge, upset by hearing a description of the man that he has become, demands the ghost remove him from the house. Stave 3. The second spirit, a ghost of Christmas present, takes Scrooge to a joyous market with people buying the makings of Christmas dinner, and to celebrations of Christmas in a miner's cottage and in a lighthouse. Scrooge and the ghosts also visit Fred's Christmas party. A major part of the stave is taken up with Bob Cratchit's family feast and introduces his youngest son, Tiny Tim, a happy boy who is seriously ill. The spirit informs Scrooge that Tiny Tim will die unless the course of events changes. Before disappearing, the spirit shows Scrooge 2 hideous, emaciated children named Ignorance and Want. He tells Scrooge to beware the former above all and mocks Scrooge's concern for their welfare. So interesting. What do you think of these Christmas spirits? What was your take on them, and how did they differ from maybe your memory of them?
I think they were pretty much what I remembered. I think that like maybe the look of them was different than I remembered.
The first one has like a glowing hat, which I had completely did not remember that. And he was very small, like kind of dwarfish, it was said. And whereas the second one was like a giant.
Yeah. They said the first one was like, it was like a young person that looked old or something like that.
Yeah, almost like a kid.
Yeah. Of course, in the story, I think it's really effective that we get Scrooge and you take him back to square one, right? And you see someone before they're jaded by the world, before they've become disgruntled. And you see this really innocent version of him, and you're seeing people being kind to him, and you're seeing like a life that he could have led had he, not been tied to the money and stuff. And like a relationship that he clearly was invested in broke off because of his investments in the money. And then you just track that across and you see where that left him. And it's always felt really powerful too, because it's like those that you can make a decision to whether it's money or whatever it is, but you can make a decision to give import to certain things in your life. And here, like he chooses the money and ends up miserable. And seeing him sad and sort of not able to handle his own past, he's ashamed by it, and he clearly needs therapy and he needs to talk about it. But instead, he buries it all down.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how when he goes to his past, he comments a lot on like, there's carolers, there's like the look of things, the way people are behaving. And he's like, I don't like this now. Mm-hmm. But right now, as I'm seeing it through the lens of time, there's like a nostalgia built into it because he remembers it as a kid. He like remembers it how he felt about it at the time. And it restores that sense of joy. And I think that was a big theme here too, and something that's in a lot of his work, because you notice like Oliver Twist and a lot of his characters there's like a young character, and so he was really good at like seeing the world through the eyes of children, and like how that's something that adults can sort of tap into, like remember how they saw the world as children, and that can like bring them a sense of joy or remind them of a time before they were as cynical as they are now, maybe. Apparently that's true in a lot of his work, but definitely true here.
I have another comment on the third stave, which is just in the comparison of these ghosts, because like this is something that just came to me. The first one's very small, and that's memory. Like things that kind of fade and get smaller as time goes on.
Oh,
and
yeah,
then just
like
how
that.
large and like boisterous and like festive the present ghost is, which is in the stave 3. Something is being said there, I think, about like living in the now and embracing what's important and right in front of you, and what's like the most important in a sense and like most vital thing there.
It also shows him the truth, right? Because it shows him a lot of how people really feel about him. Because we go around to these different Christmas celebrations, and people bring up Scrooge, and it's like, don't bring up Scrooge. We hate that fucking guy.
Yeah.
Right?
And shout out to Fred, by the way, for being like, I don't care. I'm going to be a nice guy.
Yeah.
I'm going to invite him every single year, no matter what.
He's not going to come, but I'm going to keep inviting him.
But that's a good person right there.
Yeah.
You know?
There's Tiny Tim. We got to talk about Tiny Tim. Iconic character, right? Like he's sickly, God bless us everyone. He pulls at the heartstrings. And this brings up something that I was also seeing as a common criticism of Dickens, is that he can be often too sentimental. That his at times can get kind of too overly sweet and saccharine. And there's a lot of pushback against this from defenders. A lot of people noting that like that's a problem of modernity. Like we look at anything sentimental and say that it's too much. But of course, this is all highly subjective.
Yeah, and I would also say like his goal for this to be sort of an everyman story, I think, is like it doesn't necessarily have to be so nuanced and subtle. I think like something being more on the nose may speak to somebody who maybe doesn't engage with this sort of material very often, and like
it's only when we're discussing like greatest works of literature of all time, right? Where often these discussions come up and people are trying to say like this is maybe something that should keep him from being the greatest novelist of all time. Which like admittedly, like that's a very high level of praise to try and level at somebody. So like you open yourself up to any kind of criticism at that point. But I think you're right on. That's why he's doing it. Like we said, like he had a purpose. He wanted people to feel bad for Tiny Tim. He wanted people to connect with the plight of Tiny Tim, and he could drive that message home to where when people would read this, who are themselves in Scrooge's position, they might think about someone like Tiny Tim.
And I would also say like the legacy of this story would have you believe that it worked, because it is a character that I think most people who read the story, I am affected by it. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, but I'm equally able to say, oh, this is a bit heavy-handed, and he's, you can see the device is so clear, like the writing is on the wall of what he's trying to do. And yet it is an effective story element, and like it is emotionally powerful, knowing that like this character is destined to die, but based on the generosity of someone else. Yeah. Spoiler alert for the end of the story, doesn't die.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he points out like if things go on the way they're going, he's going to die. And that sort of raises the specter of the future, right? Which is what we're about to move into now, which is always one of my favorite parts of this story, because I like horror and I like scary shit. And I always love the ghost of the future, right? The ghost of the Christmas yet to come, how freaking scary he is. So let's get into that. Stave 4. The third spirit, the ghost of Christmas yet to come, shows Scrooge a Christmas day in the future. The silent ghost reveals scenes involving the death of a disliked man whose funeral is attended by local businessmen only on condition that lunch is provided. His charwoman, laundress, and the local undertaker steal his possessions to sell to a fence. When he asks the spirit to show a single person who feels emotion over his death, he is only given the pleasure of a poor couple who rejoice that his death gives them more time to put their finances in order. When Scrooge asks to see tenderness connected with any death, the ghost shows him Bob Cratchit and his family mourning the death of Tiny Tim. The ghost then allows Scrooge to see a neglected grave with a tombstone bearing Scrooge's name. Sobbing, Scrooge pledges to change his ways. Stave 5, end of the book. Scrooge awakens on Christmas morning, a changed man. He makes a large donation to the charity he rejected the previous day, anonymously sends a large turkey to the Cratchit family for Christmas dinner, and spends the afternoon at Fred's Christmas party. The following day, he gives Cratchit an increase in pay and begins to become a father figure to Tiny Tim. From then on, Scrooge treats everyone with kindness, generosity, and compassion, embodying the spirit of Christmas. Okay, so let's talk first about the third spirit, the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
Yeah, it's fucking metal, dude. It's badass. He's
doesn't
like speak.
Silent. He just points at shit. He looks like
Points
death.
at stuff.
Like I always loved him.
And like that is the specter that's coming for all of us, right? It is scary, and it is something to think of a character like Scrooge not thinking about his mortality up to this point and his legacy, if that's what he's worried about, because ultimately that's kind of that's the thing that breaks him down. He's like, no one cares once I'm gone and my grave is left neglected. This is how people are going to
act when I die. They, my legacy.
And so that's the thing that kind of kicks him into gear. But there's a couple other things, right? Like they see the death of Tiny Tim. They see the death of somebody else that they don't know who it is. I think at one point the sheets are like covered up, and the death is like trying to get him to pull the sheets off, and he won't do it.
Yeah, I think I think he's afraid it's himself, right? Like this is his own death. Yeah,
I think it's meant to be himself.
Right.
Yeah. He won't face it. That's
right.
He won't.
He doesn't want to face the reality that this person that no one cares about and is talking ill of, and only one come to their funeral if lunch is provided, that's him.
Yeah, and then seeing the way that all comes together. That I mean, I remember early on, and you know what I thought about? I may have seen this, maybe not the first time, but one of the most affecting times that I experienced the story was a stage play. I think I remember going to a local theater to see a version of this. Like, I would have been pretty young, probably 10 or younger, and I think I remember that being a time that I like first questioned my mortality. Yeah,
I mean, it does make you think about death. It makes you think about how you're going to be remembered. It makes you think about the sort of legacy of your choices. Yeah, and it I think all of that. He sort of he said he like promises to embody all of that. And then let's talk about the end, right? So in the end, he makes some charitable acts. He makes a big donation, makes sure that there's a turkey provided to the Cratchit family. But then he goes on to sort of mentor Tiny Tim. And it's said that he would go on to live his life with generosity. He's smiling again. He's laughing again. And it's shown that like generosity brings him joy, brings him happiness.
Well, specifically, like one of the first things he does, I think it's when he's giving the money to the charity, he's like doubling over, laughing and cheering. And like that's it's having like an effect on him in like a really outward way.
Yeah. So the optimist in me, who admittedly is just like a little tiny sliver of myself these days.
Cold dark.
But yeah, it's still in there. And like I see this as a net good, especially for the time. I see a lot of people reading this and feeling like, oh, generosity, like, you're helping out people, but it also helps you feel better, helps you, and brings you joy. And I think that's totally true. The cynical side of me looks at this and wonders, is it enough? Does it change the dynamic significantly between the classes? Does it change that Scrooge has all this wealth? Yes, he's giving some of it away, but how much? And how much is enough to where it's like it makes you feel good, and yet you're still keeping 99% of it, and so like you're just feeling a little better about that 1% you give, that 2% you give. And you hear about billionaires giving some large donation. I always like question like how much should we be celebrating that, because that's often like, yes, it might make them feel good, but if you think about the percentage of their total net worth and the size of that donation, it would be like us celebrating if like, one of us gave $5 to somebody, right? Like it's that kind of thing, because that's how much money it is to them. So it's worth keeping in perspective sometimes.
And you're also hoping that it's something that's like a sustainable thing. It's not just like a drop in the bucket somewhere that they're able to do to feel good and to for good press or whatever.
Well, and it also upholds the system that has created this inequity and kind of says like, as long as they're being generous with their wealth, then everything's okay. And you could argue that that's, fundamentally a problem if the system itself is fundamentally a problem and needs to be reimagined.
Yeah. When you were saying you didn't know if it was enough, I thought you meant like the moral of the story, because I think I don't think Scrooge is doing enough. No, the acts that he does, he's giving stuff. He sounds like he's going to be a good person the rest of his life, all that kind of stuff.
Did it say something about him giving a raise to everybody? That's definitely something he needs to do. Give everybody a raise.
To his shop clerk or whatever. Yeah.
He needs to give it to everybody.
but what I will say is, like, I think as far as the effect of the story, if you're able to, like, really internalize what the messaging of the story is, I think you don't stop at what Scrooge is doing, or at least I would hope that people who wouldn't stop at what Scrooge is doing and say, you put that into all facets of your life. You're like, try to be a better person, you know, and try to, like, live that more than just being like, I gave him a turkey. They're good. I gave this guy a couple more bucks an hour. He's good. Once.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm being kind of tongue in cheek with it, because, like, ultimately, if you view it from the period it was written in, and the legacy of it, of course, this is like a really important piece of fiction that has had, I think, a net good overall. I just think there's a cynical modern self that looks at this and says, over time, this is a story that has been used to, like, make people feel better if they just do a little bit of charity. Then they're like, okay, I'm not being a Scrooge. I'm doing a little bit of charity, and now I can feel good about myself.
Yeah.
But that's not Dickens' fault. That's not how it was intended. He was writing this in a period where there was huge inequity. People were unaware of what it was like, and he was doing it on purpose so that it could be read by people in the upper class. Because if you're lecturing people, they're going to turn off, right? They're not going to listen. And he knew that, so he wanted to have characters who were redeemable. He wanted to have characters that people could identify with across all walks of life. And so I think that's laudable. I think that's really cool, and I think that ultimately this is a iconic story for very good reason.
And the way that we talk about this kind of stuff often is like it might be teaching someone in the upper class to have empathy for the first time and then continue to have empathy going forward. That's, I think, the hope and the secret sauce of literature and just storytelling in general, is that you can deliver it in that way and kind of make them better people for having read it and understand the world a little differently.
And that's something that I think is so important to remember, is that, like, taking the first steps down the right path, it's always good. And the goal should be to encourage people to continue down that path, not ridicule them for taking so long. Where have you been? Why haven't you taken this path, right? Like that, and unfortunately that can sometimes be the reaction, especially in the internet. Like, as soon as people do something good, it's like, well, where have you been? How did you not? You shouldn't have been doing this all the time. How dare you? And instead of welcoming them and saying, like, okay, yes, let's continue this growth. So I do want to try and remember that is definitely true, even as we might look at this and say, like, it's not enough, which I think is also a fair judgment to put on this.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
That's A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Definitely very fun. Cool. Always cool to go look at these things from the 1800s. I don't feel like we read a lot of novels from this period. If you enjoyed our coverage of A Christmas Carol, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. If you're on YouTube, make sure to like the video. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. We would love to get to 1,000 subscribers someday soon. Help us along that journey, and we really appreciate you listening.
So for those of you who are patrons, or if you would like to consider becoming a patron, it's patreon.com/Ink2Film. We do all kinds of cool stuff over there, bonus episodes. We also offer merch for different tiers, but our bonus episode this month, we've decided, is going to be something we were referencing in this episode, the Muppets Christmas Carol.
Right. So several of our patrons had commented that they wanted us to cover the Muppets Christmas Carol. So I would like to do it. Maybe I saw it as a kid. I don't know. I'll have to revisit it. But yeah, that would be a fun one to do over on Patreon. So we'd love to have your support over there, and your money, your generosity this time of year goes a long way.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads. I think Luke is on.
Yeah.
Anywhere you might think a podcast would be on social media, we are there. So look for Ink2Film, at Ink2Film on all those platforms.
Well, and thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music. All right, man. Let's take a few minutes here at the end to talk a little bit more about Dragonsteel. Do you have any questions?
I mean, I'm so curious. There's not enough time to dig into everything here, but I just think it's so cool that you got to go work this convention. Like, Dragonsteel's been going on for a little bit. It's now called Dragonsteel Nexus, and like he is bringing in all these other authors. and like really championing other people in the industry. And he gets a bad rap for like swallowing the industry for a lot of people, but it could be kind of a stepping stone in a sense. And I love that he is trying to create it. And it seems like this is like just taking off. So I just like, what did you think I know that you have read some of his books, but like, what did you think from that perspective? Obviously like working Fonda's booth and hanging out with her. What was all that like?
Yeah. So as far as Brandon Sanderson goes, yeah, I mean, he was the rock star of this convention. And it was striking just how managed his time was, and how big his like teams were, and how regimented everything was. And it was all down to this machine, right? Like he had built this machine, but you could see like why, right? Like a lot of it exists to sort of manage the fervent fandom that's around him. And then he was still generous, right? Generous with his time in different ways. I won a randomized, you can get selected for these lightning signings he does, and it was kind of surreal. So you go into this room that was huge, right? This immense room, and they had us line up along the like perimeter of the room. And we would just stood there, and we were like instructed by these helpers, they were just squires, they were called, to come around, and they would make sure that you had your book open to the proper page facing towards him. And he would walk the perimeter of the room, walking along the line. So you stayed where you were, and he walked, and he would just like briefly talk to you, and you were told like one item, no long interactions. Like you had all these instructions, and he would come up to you and he'd just say a quick hello, do his lightning fast signing that he does, and then move on. And it was just kind of surreal to see, him go around this entire room and do that. But it was cool too, because he's also reaching out and doing this. He was also doing some regular signings. I guess there's like multiple kinds that you can win.
So we did at a convention recently. We did a signing with him, and we had 5 minutes with him.
That's wild. That must be his more like normal ones that he has, where you can spend time.
If he can, yeah. And so like we got to ask, I got a RAFO. I asked him a question he wasn't allowed to answer at the time, which was really cool. And he signed like 8 of our things, and like was so generous with his time. I couldn't believe it, because like you said, there were literally, the convention I went to, people were like stampeding trying to get to his booth and stuff. And so I'm sure you experienced a lot of that at his convention, where it's like even the magnitude must be even bigger.
Yeah, it was pretty wild.
What was it like with like Fonda and stuff? Like how did she react to it? And like you guys did a panel together, right?
Yeah, I was on a panel with Fonda. I did one on TTRPGs for writers, so tabletop games, which was really cool, because I got to talk about the experience of introducing her to Dungeons and Dragons. And then she got to talk about how the Greenbone Saga is being adapted into a tabletop game.
That's awesome.
From that point of view of like what it's been like, and play testing that, and like seeing that was really cool. And we were also on that panel with Matt Dinneman, who is the author of Dungeon Crawler Carl, which is a book that I think
that's
is
so funny,
custom
because
designed to like be a tongue twister for me. I really struggle to say it. I managed that time.
That's so wild, because I literally just put that in my cart on Amazon, because I was like, somebody recommended it, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna buy it from Amazon, but I put it there for safekeeping so I can order it later. Yeah.
So this is a lit RPG book that has taken off. It was originally self-published and has now been picked up by traditional publishers, and is getting an adaptation. Seth MacFarlane of Family Guy fame is going to be doing some sort of adaptation for this. So something that should be on our radar for the future. But I got to meet him. He was also on this panel, and it's lit RPG is a whole genre we could do a whole thing about, but it's basically like a gamified genre where you like follow the characters and they level up in some sort of game that is like on the page. So you're like tracking their leveling up. Sometimes you're tracking their stats as they improve throughout the book and like stuff like that. I've heard Ready Player One being called like one of the proto lit RPG novels, which is interesting. But anyway, I got to meet him. He was really cool. I was on 2 other panels. The one on adaptations, which I already talked about, which was huge. That was really fun. I'm not gonna be able to remember. I'm terrible with names, so like I can't remember everybody. But I was on that with an author. I believe her name was Christina Farley, and she is having an adaptation made for her work. So that's why she was on the panel. Cool. I was also on that with a YouTube creator, Danny Mata, who has a massive YouTube channel and TikTok. I think he mostly talks about anime. So it was interesting having him on there. And Daniel Yoakum, I think, was the other panelist. That was an awesome panel. I thought it went really well. I got to talk about our Hall of Fame episodes. and like
Cool.
how we defined what makes a good adaptation, right? Because that was kind of like at the heart of this panel, is like, what is a good adaptation? And I was like, well, we've talked about this a lot. We've thought about this a ton on our podcast. So I got to like trot out my 3 pillars of adaptation, and then of course talking about times where the adaptation falls short and why was also cool. And then I was on a final panel about writing horror, which ended up going great. It was also super well attended. There was a ton of people in that room. All these panels were great. And I was on that with Stephen Diamond, I think was the author's name. And then there was someone who runs a podcast called something about the Silverlight Archive or something. It's like a Cosmere-related podcast. I can't remember. Anyway, I thought that panel went really great. One of the most gratifying things was I had people coming up to me after both of these panels and throughout the weekend while I was at Fonda's booth and telling me that like they were some of their favorite panels from the entire convention, which is always really awesome to hear. I even had one guy come up to me and like wanted to buy my book. And I was like, oh, sorry, man, I don't have a book yet. I'm like
That's
currently
cool.
querying one, but it is not available to buy.
Yeah. Did you point them to your short stories?
I did. I put it to my
that's good.
website and I said I have short fiction you can read. But yeah, no novel just of yet. But that was all really gratifying. But again, Fonda's fans, there were so many. It was really cool because like I got to have like a ringside seat for a lot of these people coming up and getting signed.
And you guys were there, like, speaking of which, I'm wearing my shirt right now.
Ooh,
but you were
nice.
there with, I bought the shirt, like, when Fonda first, like, put it on social media that she was, like, these people were collaborating with her.
Yeah, Marauders Market.
Marauders Market, I saw that you were there with them, too, and I was like, this is so cool that you get to have this experience and meet all these people.
Yeah.
And Daniel Green, that we talk about fairly often on the podcast, he's a big fantasy, sci-fi YouTuber.
I met Daniel Green. He was super nice. I met him twice. First time I was just a quick hello, and I got to tell him that, I was a fan of his channel and been watching for a long time. Second time, it was like a quieter moment where like there are different periods where like the exhibitors are allowed to their booths, but like the other people aren't. And he was there at that moment. I got to go up to him and my wife Annalisa and I got pictures with him. And he was super friendly. Got to talk to him about Fonda because he's a massive fan of Fonda. So whenever I could bring up Fonda with him, I definitely made sure to.
Sure.
And then I also got to meet Ren from the Corridor Crew channel. And he was so genuine and just like friendly, and like he was so like excited to talk to me, even though he must have talked to 1,000 people that day. It was really, really cool. Like he just made such a great impression on me, and I was like, man, you seem like a cool guy. And I knew that he was big into the Cosmere. Like he's done like videos with Brandon Sanderson and stuff.
That's cool.
It was very cool. He was really nice, and we talk about their stuff all the time as we talk about like special effects and breakdowns of that. But yeah, I wanted to get back to talking about being ringside for Fonda and like her signing stuff, and like people would come up to her and talk about like what her books meant to them. And that was just so cool to see, as like people got emotional and people were talking about how much it meant to them. And it was like their favorite books of all time, and, like connecting with certain characters, and just the array of fan reactions was really neat to see. And she continues to be like someone who I really look up to in the industry, and how she handles herself and how she interacts with people is something that I really admire. And then, one more thing about Brandon Sanderson. One more little quick story, and then we can wrap it up. On the last day, I don't know if I'm not supposed to say this. They didn't tell us we weren't allowed to talk about it, but on the last day...
No NDAs were signed.
Yeah, exactly. The Squires came around, and they like came up to us, and they were like, he's coming. And we're like, what? And we're like, he's coming 10 minutes before. So like they're gonna like close down the floor 10 minutes before it's supposed to close because he's coming. And like they didn't even like say who it was, It was just like, we know. We know. So it was like kind of this surreal moment where like they closed everything down and like everybody stayed at their booths.
Everybody's like, act casual, act cool. Everybody look cool. Like lean up against something.
Yeah, it was like weird because we had like sold out everything because speaking of Marauders Market, by the way, Mariah and Chris are the two who work on Marauders Market. Mariah is, I think, like the main owner. They were amazing. They were really, really cool people. Really fun to get to know them. And between the four of us, so it was my wife and I and them two who worked Fonda's booth. And she was so busy. She was off to all these different panels and stuff. So we had to kind of hold down the fort. I had a few panels myself, so I couldn't be there all the time. So it was really cool to have all these people helping out. And they did a great job. So just shout out to them. But yeah, it was just us four at this point because Fonda was on a panel. She was literally on a panel about like women in fantasy with Robin Hobb and I can't remember the name of the other author. someone who's very famous who I just am not as familiar with her work. So it was kind of one of those situations where it's kind of unfortunate because like we wanted to go watch the panel, but we also were like, we kind of wanted to say hi to Brandon. So we ended up waiting, and he did make his rounds, and he stopped to talk to every single vendor and like look at the stuff that they were selling and stuff. It was really cool, and pose for pictures. Even he posed for pictures with us. I got a couple of those I posted on social media, and he signed a couple more things while he was standing there. And like it's just surreal. Like he has all these people who are helping him out, like taking photos. He has someone who just like carries a box of pins, just follows him around, and like if he like says give them a pen, they like give you a pen. And he does that for if you have like cosplay or something, he like always gives you a pen, I guess.
It's so crazy to see that level of fame from an author in today's like. It's just, I mean, it's amazing.
An author who hasn't had an adaptation. I mean, Wheel of Time, but that's more Robert Jordan. Yeah, he hasn't had a major adaptation yet. And once he does, like this, it's just going to take off even more. But he's already an absolute rock star in the fantasy world for sure.
And I have this conversation all the time with people too, because like I've read all of his work, at least all of his Cosmere work. Currently reading Wind and Truth, by the way.
Yeah,
getting pretty far and really enjoying that. But he is like putting out books so quickly. Everyone knows how quickly he writes. Yep. And then the quality, the way that he's able to maintain quality is just, it blows my mind. And I guess there's a reason why he has that level of fame, but it wasn't always this way. Like he built up to this. So it's been really cool to see.
Yeah. And he just seems like a genuine like nerd. Like, you know, he loves Magic the Gathering. Like he loves fantasy. He's a fan of all these other authors, you know, like he told us that he had just read Jade City for the first time and loved it.
Shit.
He like
Nice.
wants it to be adapted. He was saying like, so at top of his list of things he wants adapted. So that was really cool to hear. Yeah, really awesome.
Was Fonda there for that?
She wasn't there, but so after her, again, I don't know if this is something I shouldn't be telling her, but like after their panel they did, all three of them were like brought to Brandon because he wanted to talk to them too, but he knew they were doing a panel at the time. So they were all like escorted by these squires to like go see him somewhere else at another location and like meet with him and talk to him. And it was funny because Fonda was saying that like on the way, like someone would come running up to them, like each one of them individually to get them to sign stuff. And like the squire they were with was like too nice and wasn't like turning people away. So it was just like they would only walk a few feet and then have to stop and sign something, walk a few feet, have to stop and sign something. Because Robin Hobb, I don't know if you know, she's like also a big legend in fantasy.
I mean, incredible. Yeah, she and like my fiance Caitlin is like she holds Robin Hobb in such high regard that like maybe even beyond like a Robert Jordan or a Brandon Sanderson. Like
yeah, she's massive in fantasy. I've never read any of her stuff, but like I know how well it's regarded and I want to. The Assassin's Apprentice, I think, is like the first book in that series I really want to read. There were so many amazing authors around us. Like Daniel Green was like literally kitty corner to us or like one row over, but Brian McClellan was like behind us. There was Christopher, I don't know how to say his name, but he's got a big series that's been blowing up, the Sun Eater series. He was like right across from us. Matt Dinneman was like on the next row over. So like, there's just all these like big authors all around us. It was a really cool spot to be, but like honestly, Fonda, she was a huge draw. She had every time she came back to the booth, like lines formed that went around, and then squires had to keep coming to like cut them off because they were coming like too long,
blocking people's booths and stuff.
Yeah, so they would come and be like, you have to come back. They'd give people different time periods to like come back, and they'd send them away. It was just a really interesting special event. It was a lot of fun.
And what a way to experience it too, like with Fonda in that way. And man, what a lifetime memory kind of thing.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's something that I'm going to remember forever for sure. And it was an honor to be there. I love that I got to participate in the way that I did, but then also got to help Fonda out. Being like an exhibitor was a really unique experience because you got to like go onto the floor before everybody else and like, see everything while there's not like big crowds around, which is just a very different experience than most people have. We also got to go into the Dragonsteel store. There was like a period where exhibitors could go in before they let everybody else in. So that was really cool too. You got to go in there and not feel like you were being rushed through like everybody else. So it kind of felt like being a VIP in a way. And I know I owe a lot of that to Fonda, so definitely thank her for that. But it was just really, really cool. And my wife had a great time too. So I was a little worried 'cause she worked hard. Like, and we both did, honestly. Like we worked hard, but she really worked hard at that booth. But I know she had a great time and was talking about like how much fun she had. So
you guys look like you're having the time of your lives. So very cool.
It was great. All right, that's going to be it for this week. Again, if I met you at Dragonsteel, or if you're listening because you heard about Ink to Film at Dragonsteel, thank you so much. And hopefully stick around. We're going to be covering Scrooged next week, which should be a fun one. And then our final episode we'll do of the year is something called a Last Looks episode, where we look back at everything we covered throughout the year and make some judgments on like what the best books were we read, what the best adaptations we covered this year are. So you're going to want to stick around for that one too. But until next time,
keep adapting.